Good afternoon, everybody, to our today's webinar, which we entitled, Has the European Union Risen Up to the Challenges of Geopolitics? Europe after the Czech Presidency of the Council. Now, we would like to focus this afternoon, of course, on the achievements of the Czech Presidency of the Council of the European Union, but we would also like to look at it in a slightly broader perspective. First of all, it was preceded by the French presidency, and it was actually the French presidency who immediately had to deal with the aftermath of the Russian aggression, the war of aggression in Ukraine from 24th of February. And since that time, I think we have an EU agenda, which of course has priorities which will not go away, from climate change to energy policy, to industrial policy, to migration, etc. But I think we also have to realize that the war in Ukraine has shaped to a large extent important parts of the agenda. We cannot look, for instance, at energy policy the same way we did before. We already at the summit in Versailles had, I think, a new focus on defense policy, on sovereignty with the strategic compass. Climate change, of course, is intricately linked to that. So all that, I think, makes it exceedingly difficult to conduct the EU policy in a way which is stable and predictable. But I think one thing which is also maybe at the heart of the challenges we face, as in all this, to keep EU solidarity and make sure that we act as one. Now, I'm not going to give my own judgment on the Czech presidency. Let me just remind you that it did receive, as the preceding French presidency, very high marks, and I think many commentators noted the excellent negotiating skills, the calm and determined way the Czech presidency steered the European Union in conjunction, of course, with the Commission and the European Council through this difficult period, and finally also managed to not only deal with the immediate fallout, but also to deal with the agenda, which of course was already previously agreed on in the framework of the trio presidencies, but also in its proper outlook on the 6 months ahead. I'm not going to mention any highlights. I leave that maybe, if I can, to Martin, who will be our first speaker, and then maybe come in if I think we could still focus a bit more on the one or other issue. Let me first of all start by introducing our excellent panel of today. As I said, the first speaker will be Martin Wukalek, who is the Executive Director of the European Institute for European Policy in Prague. Warm welcome to you, Martin. It's a particular pleasure to see also Georgina Wright, who is Director of the Institut Montaigne's Europe program, and whom we had already half a year ago in a webinar on the French presidency. It's also a pleasure to welcome Vladislava Gubalova, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Globsec Policy Institute in Bratislava. And then we have two colleagues in Austria, Paul Schmidt, who is the Secretary General of the Austrian Society for European Politics in Vienna, and also Livia Benko, who is a Research Fellow at the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy in Vienna. If anybody wonders why we have participants from the Czech Republic, Austria, Slovakia, and France, the idea was to do this in what is very often called the Austerlitz format, and we have an Austerlitz format plus. Austerlitz format means a loose grouping of the Central European countries of the Czech Republic, Austria, and Slovakia, and the plus, of course, is France. With that, I would immediately like to start, and maybe if I could turn right over to you, Martin, please.
Okay, thank you very much for organizing this one, and we are really glad that I could join and we could support this event. So just focusing on the Czech presidency, first and foremost, like I was doing a little bit brainstorming of main points to pin out, of course, because there were many, and overall the presidency was very successful. We probably can agree all on that. Of course, I will be trying to maybe tackle a little bit of things which I would potentially like to see that they have been done better. But also given the fact that it happened, and there will be also next presidencies, not only for the Czech Republic, but for other countries, like I want to point out some key facts or like key settings we were starting the presidency with because it's rather good to take it in the account when elaborating. First and foremost, I would like just to say that there was in the Czech Republic quite difficult situation for the presidency itself because of the previous government of Andrej Babiš. The government was not putting enough dedication, in my opinion, to the presidency, and they weren't dedicating enough finances and personal capacity on it. And the attitude on high political level was rather passive, and I would dare to say even sometimes even critical against the presidency and the opportunity it might have brought. Quite contrary, what was good and what was extremely helpful was that the efforts among the civil servants were there, and they were aware that they need to prepare the presidency and they will need to focus there. We as European were, for example, part of the research projects for the Czech government and so on, and we are also trying to contribute with our other think tank partners to support the presidency. So that was like first of the pillar, like how it started the foundation of the successful Czech presidency, I would say, the effort of the civil servants, first and foremost. Secondary, there were the parliamentary elections in October 21, where the focus of the newly established politicians were first and foremost to form the government, and then, of course, focus first and foremost on the pressing home issues. And rather after that, they just started to focus on the presidency. So there was a little bit of that vacuum. But even that time, there was an ongoing French presidency, and I must say that, at least from my personal experience, but also from what I'm hearing, the work in a trio was done very nicely. The cooperation with French was done on a very regular basis, and also like the exchanges. I remember, Georgina, that we met in Paris also. So there was not only like the governmental level of cooperation, but also like NGO think tank level of cooperation. So thanks to the French presidency and the basis it set for us, we were able to deliver the successful presidency. But then what is very important to mention is, of course, the unprecedented Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, which rapidly changes all the focus of the Czech priorities. It changes all the preparations, and literally, like as you could imagine, it changes everything. So it again required a huge pressing attitude of our politicians and our civil servants and everybody around to start of change a little bit the focus of the presidency and the preparations and everything. What is there may be positive and what helped a bit, to be honest, and I don't want to say that there is anything positive on the Russian aggression towards Ukraine, but what was, let's say, supportive for the Czech presidency was that first and foremost, like it enabled us to have a like stronger cooperation and stronger position together as the EU, and the countries were potentially more able to find the consensus in some topics rather than focus on these nitty-gritty disagreements between them, and like focusing on these details, which would potentially be happening more often if there is no war in Ukraine. So this could at least help a bit the presidency. And what I'm really glad about is that it was the Czech Republic having the presidency, because there is a very close geographical and culture closeness to the Ukraine. So we were the one who were like really pushing for the cooperation among member states, and we were the one who were pushing for the bigger and stronger support and resolute stance against Russia in the war in Ukraine. So this sort of helped us form the more resolute and more common attitude to presidency. But then, like the presidency, of course, came, and the topics were a lot revolving, of course, about the implications of the war in Ukraine, and there were, of course, high focus on the energy crisis. the inflation was rising. So like in these areas also, like we had to focus a lot on many things. And there, like what I really need to admire and what was like done greatly was the extra work our personal Czech personnel both in Brussels and both in the Czech Republic were doing. And now I'm just quoting the data from the Office of the Government, but just to give you the overview, Czech Republic chaired about 50 council meetings, which 6 of them were extraordinary. We had like 60 meetings on the level of ambassadors. We had 1,500 working groups and over 100 meetings with the European Parliament. And also among the presidency itself and these official things, there are these not so official things which are invisible to us, of course, like those are the exchanges of emails, calls, everything what was happening there, and like the capacity we were having with the finances we were having for the presidency, everybody was trying to do probably their best, and thus because of that attitude and because of the little bit better cooperation, let's say, facing the crises we were facing, it was managed very well, I must say. Of course, like we can then discuss more like topical issues, focus on the energy, focus a little bit on the security. We can focus on the free packs of new sanctions against Russia, which were managed through our presidency. And if I should focus on like positive aspects, what is good for the Czech Republic from the presidency was very well mentioned or well done, let's say. I would say that like exactly, first and foremost, the important focus on the important aspects, which was the support of Ukraine, resolute and coordinated attitude, focus on the energy crisis, focus on those most pressing issues. On the negative side there, of course, what was sometimes a little bit missing was, of course, a little bit like, let's say, more longer term solutions, of course, which is understandable because, of course, first and foremost, you are trying to put down the fire, which is the most burning one. But when we are speaking, of course, on the energy and so on, there was some, of course, intentions to focus on longer term solutions. But maybe this is a little bit missed opportunity there, first and foremost. But overall, that was great. What also helped was that, or what was also very positive, is that definitely like the successful presidency created the higher credibility for the Czech Republic among our partners, among other countries, and we are now like probably more received as a more proactive and responsible actor rather than some kind of constantly dissatisfied or not interested critic of the European Union and of the decision-making process happening in Brussels, which we are like an integral part of. And of course, last but not least to mention, it's very positive because I think it very much increased the skills of our civil servants, and it also enabled our politicians maybe to reassess their focus a bit on the European issues, and maybe they now see that it's also important to be active not only on a like local area and local issues, but like maybe this is where the important decisions are made, and we shouldn't step aside. But if I should be a little bit like also maybe critic and maybe just open the discussion with some things which could be, at least to my opinion, done a bit better. It's of course like, and many people are like saying that the communication about the Czech presidency was done adequately, at least I think, but we lost sort of the potential to make it happen in a better way and bring EU topics with a special focus on our role in the EU topics among broader Czech common citizens, let's say, in that way. So like Czech presidency and the presidency of each country is a special opportunity to really like bring European topics among common citizens. And we were trying, Office of the Government was trying and so on, but like now I'm a little bit afraid that like citizens, mostly what we are doing the sociological research together with our partners, like most of the citizens knew that some kind of presidency is happening and it's some kind of important thing. But if you dig a little bit more into the details, of course, they are like completely unaware what does it mean for us, what's good, what's bad, what is our role of the Czech Republic, and so on. So this momentum could be used a little bit better. And secondly, like speaking of momentum, and that's my last point probably for that beginning, is that like I would say that the momentum of the presidency when everybody was extremely active here in the Czech Republic and also in Brussels, and these topics were having highest priority. I'm a little bit afraid that the momentum will be sort of lost now, that everybody is satisfied that we created and we managed to handle the presidency very well, and we did. But now, like, everybody's like a little bit maybe more relaxed, and I'm a little bit afraid that we could be losing that momentum. And secondly, connected to that, I'm afraid that also there is a lack of capacities of the Czech government, Czech ministries overall to retain people who were having a great experience of the Czech presidency, who were putting the most of their time and efforts to make it happen. And there are already some shrinking of the teams, like inside what I know, like there are also even some teams which are, for example, now like losing 60% of people which were assigned for the presidency. So now they are like having only like 33 or 35% of a personal capacity. And some of the people working at the presidency, of course, are then returning to their like common positions at the ministries, home, and so on. And I'm afraid that first and foremost, they might not be interested in coming back to this position. And secondly, of course, like they are probably having a better potential, which is then very difficult, of course, for the Czech government to somehow establish and use. So what I would like to see more, of course, is that we will be able to sort of use the momentum created by the presidency more to discussions about the EU issues here in Czech Republic, and also like maybe using those who have really like a unique experience. It's like 1 in the 13 years experience with the presidency of the Council of the EU. So using these people a little bit more. So this are like small negative things there, maybe way for the improvement. I would, if there is somebody from Sweden, I would maybe recommend focusing more on this one also. And I know it's extremely difficult with all the biggest challenges there. But overall, and sorry for speaking maybe a little bit too long, but I'm full of impressions still from the presidency. But overall, definitely the positive aspects are much heavier and much bigger than these kind of small details which might have been done in a better way. And then I'm definitely looking forward for your inputs, and I'm really looking forward to discuss maybe more concrete topics for you. So thank you for the word.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you very much for this overview and also for pointing out a bit what the presidency means in terms of sort of not only sort of keeping the European Union together, but what the day-to-day work, chairing so many different sessions, etc., means, particularly for a smaller country which does not have the same capacities as Germany or France. And also thank you for pointing out a bit sort of this interplay between, on the one hand, this task of having a heavy European responsibility on the one hand, and on the other hand, to communicate that internally. And sort of all countries, I think, face this sometimes difficult situation to find the proper mix between mobilizing sort of the domestic audience, if you wish, because domestic policies don't take really a break during that 6-month time. And I think you pointed it out very well. Georgina, I wanted to ask you a bit, maybe also to look at a slightly broader question, not only how you grade the French and the Czech presidencies in terms of achieving their mandate and well beyond that, but what is your assessment also on how do you see the European Union precisely after that momentous year, which in the European Union was shaped to a large extent by the French and the succeeding Czech presidency? Where do you see us standing now, and how do you link that to the previous 2 presidencies? Georgina, please.
Great, thank you very much, Dietmar. And it's hard to come after Martin, because that was a very good and comprehensive presentation. Just before I sort of go into Paris's view of the Czech presidency and sort of more broadly where the EU is after those 2 presidencies, I think on the awareness of a presidency, I mean, in France it was the same. You know, they lit up the Eiffel Tower and many monuments across France with with the EU flag. They talked President Macron talked about the presidency relentlessly, so did all the ministers, but still at the end of it, I think there was a poll showing that people in France sort of knew that had happened, but didn't really know what France had done, and still believed that actually France had very limited influence in Brussels. So I think there is a real challenge, and I completely agree with you, for all presidencies, which is you can do, you can have the most successful presidency in Brussels, but how do you communicate that success back home? And I think that's a challenge that actually very few presidencies have been able to really address. In terms of Paris's view of the Czech presidency, I think they're very pleased with how it went, partly of course because it immediately followed the French presidency, so there was a bit of this sense of carrying on France's work, but I also think there was real recognition in Paris of actually the Czech Republic's excellent handling of the presidency, and the fact that they were able to broker agreements, and I'll come back to this, on a number of files that France wasn't able to broker an agreement on, the fact that they are seen as a trusted interlocutor, that they can forge consensus, whereas France has been sort of accused in the past of not always being the independent chair and actually pushing a lot of its own national preference. So in a way, there is real recognition of the role that the Czech Republic played. And as you said, Martin, a lot of work that went into building the trio, so France, Czech Republic, and of course Sweden, that has the presidency right now, the three governments coming together, determining a work plan for a year and a half. And I think people often forget, but these aren't three countries that necessarily have the same priorities when it comes to the EU. And I thought the agenda was with the trio agenda has been broadly respected, and that's despite Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the war, of course, putting immense pressure and changing a lot of the way the presidencies were going to be run and some of their priorities. In terms of the topics, I think, and thinking of the Czech Republic and its priorities, I think in France, there's a recognition that its handling of the Ukraine war and the EU's response to the Ukraine war has been very good. So, 3 sanction packages passed, I think, during the Czech presidency. The Repower EU, which is of course this big plan to lessen the EU's dependence on Russian fossil fuels. I think the Czech Republic's brokering of agreements in the councils, the grouping with 27 countries, was seen as essential, and also the fact that it got a price cap on gas. Of course, we know that France wasn't so sort of publicly against it, but there was a sense that France was a bit ambivalent about this, but perhaps that made it easier for the Czech Republic to broker an agreement. But it was a really tough discussion, and the Czech Republic managed to get an agreement on that. And also, I think bypassing, or getting Orban to sort of not veto the 18 billion euro aid package to Ukraine was also seen as a significant success. In terms of defense, the fact that the Czech Republic continued to kind of think about how to implement the strategic compass, which is this first attempt of, the EU really to get serious about sort of defense and security, having a hierarchy of priorities, thinking about how you're going to match capabilities. There was some movement there too. And also on climate. So a lot of the discussions for the Fit for 55 package happened during the French presidency, but I think France was criticized for not going all the way on basically sort of negotiating the easy parts and then leaving the difficult parts to the Czech Republic. And that's things like expanding the ETS, also around the carbon border adjustment mechanism, who raises the money, who decides how to allocate the funding, all of that kind of stuff. And those discussions also accelerated under the Czech presidency. Movement on tech, artificial intelligence agreement, innovation and resilience in the digital economy. These are all things that France really cares about, and the French EU Commissioner Thierry Breton really cares about. And so there was some movement, a significant movement, I think, under the Czech presidency. But I think one of the big successes in Paris's eyes was, of course, the hosting of the European Political Community. So the first summit happening in Prague. Real sense in Paris that was a success. And I know I heard this from Czech officials that France had been sort of very supportive, but this was really the Czech Republic leading on it, organizing it. The first time you had all of Europe's leaders around the table, Mitsotakis from Greece and Erdogan from Turkey, and the UK also participating, and then agreeing to hosting the 4th European Political Community Summit. and a real sense that there was an opportunity for bilateral and trilateral and minilateral, discussions. And that was very important for Macron personally, that this was a success, because he was, of course, seen as the person behind the idea. But it really took on a Europe-wide dimension with the Czech Republic hosting the summit. And I think where the Czech Republic was able to do something that France perhaps chose not to was move forward with free trade agreement discussions as well. So when I'm in Brussels, I hear of the French winter during the French presidency, which is basically, if you looked at their massive list of priorities, everything was in there, apart from really moving forward on free trade agreements. And of course, the Czech Republic put discussions with Chile and New Zealand and Australia back on track. And I think that's where you do see a difference between the Czech presidency and the French presidency, and I suspect between the Swedish presidency and the French presidency, is that you hear much more about free trade agreements and the need to open market, to access to market, and a lot less talk about trade defense instruments, anti-coercion, and how you kind of sort of screen an outward and inward investment, which is of course something that the French presidency pushed very much, which was we've got to stop being naive. Not everyone is playing by free trade rules anymore, and so we need to think critically about how we protect the single market without, of course, closing it. So keeping it open, but also protecting it. And I think that's where you do see a difference, where France perhaps wasn't as enthusiastic about free trade talks as the Czech presidency was. So I'll end quickly on sort of two things. The first is, and Martin said this, I think a real sense of good collaboration, Czech Republic being a trusted interlocutor. I think Franz Timmermans said that the Czech Republic was one of the most successful presidencies in the last 10 years. So I think that's high praise. But of course, I think the view in Paris is a lot of that is down to the Czech Republic and the way it handled it, but also no presidency is done in isolation. And France said this about its own presidency. A lot of it depends on the work that was done before and the work that comes after. And I think Paris particularly appreciated the collaboration with the Czech Republic during its presidency, and then of course during the Czech presidency. So finally, on Dietmar's question, which is the most important, I think, and we'll probably come back to in the Q&A, is on the EU and how it's changed. I think fundamentally COVID, the Ukraine war, and all the consequences of the Ukraine war has shown that the EU cannot not be geopolitical, and it has to make decisions. We're talking about, the start of the year, and this is more a reaction to the US Inflation Reduction Act, but we're talking about the EU moving on industrial policy in ways that was never, would never have been possible, I think, a few years ago. And we're seeing that this kind of slogan, well, what had been a slogan that, the unity is the EU's strength, actually really works. It works vis-a-vis Russia and in support of Ukraine, but it also works when you're standing up to partners and also competitors who perhaps don't play by the same trade rules that you do. And so I suspect that we will now see the EU acting much more together, and that will be difficult discussions. You're seeing it around the EU's response to the Inflation Reduction Act, with Germany and France perhaps asking for a loosening of state aid rules, and others saying that's not a good way to go about it and we should be thinking about other answers. So it's going to be tricky, but I suspect we're seeing an EU that looks radically different than it did 5 years ago. Maybe we can come back to it in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Georgina. Thank you, first of all, for also highlighting some of the achievements in more specific terms. And thank you also for pointing out the successful holding of the first summit of the European Political Community, which of course was not directly linked to the role of the presidency, but which was, I think, a very important event, and of course is also to be seen in the whole context of the presidency, but also, of course, with the war in Ukraine. And yes, I would tend to agree with you when you say that we see some things happening now in the European Union in terms of defining its role. You may say in geopolitical terms, or look at it in a more sober way, saying in sort of expanding and deepening its toolbox to be able to sort of take care of its interests in a more coherent and solitary manner. So that, I think, is very important. And in that respect, I think both the French and the Czech presidencies made an important contribution to bring that about. Vladislava, you look at the Czech presidency as a neighbor from Slovakia. You are also a direct neighbor, of course, to Ukraine, being maybe more directly, immediately affected by the war than many other countries in Europe. And therefore, I would be interested to hear your take also with regard to some of the specific decisions taken and its impact. Slovakia, for instance, is, of course, in a very special situation when it comes to energy policy and also with regard to its at least previous dependence on fossil fuels from Russia. So what is your take on both sort of the Czech presidency and also how Georgina framed it in terms of this being sort of a package and something which was jointly consecutively done by the two presidencies?
Thank you very, very much, Dietmar. Very, very easy questions I think you gave me. I wonder what I'm going to do with my 7 minutes. No, of course, actually, probably to start with your previous question towards Georgina on one of the changes that we are observing in the region when it comes to what EU do we see now comparing to the EU just a year ago or a little bit over a year ago. And definitely with the war in Ukraine, what we are seeing is a certain shift of the gravitational center when it comes to European security to the east. And this is why for us, actually, it was the right time and under the right circumstances, even though extremely unfortunate circumstances with the war next door, that we have actually a country from the region, from Central and Eastern Europe, that is presiding, that is holding the presidency. So from a Slovak point of view, immediately we see that on 2 points, on more of a change, general change of the EU, that we see the region now a bit more credible, a bit more listened to, but also itself, the region focusing on EU policies and the importance that we can bring certain constructive ideas and we can lead in certain areas. And on the other hand, we've seen the presidency, the Czech presidency, as really representing the region, representing Ukraine. Martin already mentioned that the ties, the specific ties that are a bit more evolved or different comparing to other parts of the European Union, perhaps. So the presidency was, in a sense, an advocate, but also a facilitator for the region's expertise. And I think that in some areas, there's still somewhat of a unmatched expertise here in the region that can be used and will be used, and it's being used. But also what is important, why is it important for Slovakia and Central Europe that the Czech Republic was holding the presidency, is that we experienced probably similar challenges. You already, Dietmar, pointed out that we found ourselves really on the front line of a war with an imminent threat to our security. You pointed out very correctly our specific dependency on Russia's fossil fuels and the infrastructure that we have, which supports that dependency still, even though all of our work and attempts. And you said, yes, actually the use of fossil fuels is still quite high, and yes, we're still struggling. So in Czech Republic, it's like 70%, in Slovakia and Austria, 65%. A lot of that have been in the past straight coming through supplies from Russia. And now we know that this has to change and is changing. But we also had a very high flow of refugees, really spiraling at some point energy and food prices, The energy inflation, I think in the Czech Republic in September was 41%, which is among the highest. The food inflation was almost 30% both in Slovakia and the Czech Republic. And then maybe it's worth mentioning, keeping in mind that our economies are export-oriented economies and with a quite proper focus on auto industry. So actually, we're starting to see that this type of model is becoming a challenge. It will become eventually a challenge for our countries if we are to follow the ambitious and in principle agreeable plans and actions when it comes to of course, energy security, but more so as well to climate change and protection. But so what to do, right? Here in Slovakia, of course, we saw that very, very, very rightfully so, as Martin pointed out, one maybe or two, I would say, main priorities or focus was, and maybe most time spent was Ukraine and energy security. I would point out perhaps two. With Ukraine, yes, as an advocate, as really feeling the special connection, pushing for support now, support for the future, being through different mechanisms used, financial, military, humanitarian, legal. We already discussed the 3 rounds of sanctions. Not to forget the freezing of the visa waiver. This was an interesting issue as well, spearheaded from the get-go by the Czech presidency. But then again, it was a crisis mode presidency for the most part, and Martin said that to some extent the long-term solutions or policies took a little bit of a back seat. And when it came to energy security, really there were 2 pillars or 2 challenges immediate that needed to be dealt with, and that was already mentioned: the reduced prices and kind of stabilizing the energy prices and reduce dependence on Russia's supply of fossil fuels. But here I would say with a caveat, it seemed to me not necessarily reduce dependence on the Russia's supply of fossil fuels, sustain renewable sources, but really to make sure that we pass the winter, right? It was the winter is coming was kind of the motto, and it was the push for a while. And yes, indeed, I think that Martin is right that there were about 8 meetings together on energy, right? For the 6 months, a lot, relentless attempts for negotiation. I would say that at times there was a threat to legally use, which was available to use QMV and not seeking consensus, which is interesting coming from a Czech presidency. Czech Republic traditionally has not been fans of using this method of decision making, but at the end, by December, you pointed it out, we had the energy price cap, the emergency brake mechanism. We had, very important for this region, for us is the joint gas purchasing agreement, as well as a very important, I guess, for our region, the solidarity mechanism in case of a gas supply cut, and that was sought to find a common European solutions. And here the region, given the challenges that we have, certainly was seeking this common European solution, and it was brokered, rightly so, by the Czech presidency. But I would say that one maybe topic that should be also mentioned here is the focus on nuclear energy. So, right, so we're talking about alternative sources, but not necessarily renewable sources. This was from the get-go important to the Czech presidency. This is important for the region, meaning Slovakia for sure, France, although it's not in our region, of course. Actually, to the newest Eurobarometer survey, 58% of EU citizens right now are supporting more investment in nuclear energy. And to our very educated audience, it's not shocking that France gets support over 70%. In our neck of woods, which is Slovakia and Czech Republic, over 60%. And of course, not surprisingly, in Austria, it's around 30% support. But this was a topic that was prime, and for our region, for Slovakia, definitely very, very important. In fact, we opened a 3rd block of in our nuclear power plants at the beginning of this year, which is predicted to be able to cover about 13% of the total electricity expenditure of Slovakia. So this is kind of what I wanted to distinguish, that in this crisis mode actions and solutions to be found, there was a look into not solely following just more advanced and advanced plans and long-term policies, but also alternative solutions. So with the renewable sources, of course, I wouldn't say that nothing was done, and this will be absolutely unfair. Some procedures for installations, for example, were eased. Some access to funds, of course, within the Renew EU as well. There was a lot of movement. But for example, the agreement on 45% of energy to be coming from renewables by 2030, that was not completed. And the Czech Republic itself, I think it's evaluating that they themselves would not be able to reach that by that target date. So we see that there has been a strategic thinking as well as there has been some strategic thinking, but there has been a lot of crisis mode thinking in the negotiations and finding the unity, because again, I think that Martin pointed out very well, in the face of aggression and adversity, we tend to cling together and to be unified, and maybe this was contributing to a lot of the movement on the files and a lot of negotiations being done. And then maybe kind of finish with the last remark. When we think about renewables, when we think about emissions, when we think about the Green Deal, we also have to keep in mind really the very complex geopolitical environment that we find ourselves into, and the European Union is, because there is still disruption of the supply chains. So and there is still dependency on China when it comes to delivering certain parts, certain materials, refinement of those materials, even if they're not originally China located, go through China to come to us. And that all of that vis-a-vis these tensions between US and China, which more and more experts are not seeing them as being subsiding, but actually changing in nature. So we find ourselves, as Georgina said, we cannot not be geopolitical. We will have to step up to the plate, but we also have to be aware exactly of looking not only Eurocentric, but really pushing ourselves out and seeing what are all of the challenges, and then creating the policies according to, in response to these challenges, or predicting, even forecasting some of the trends ahead. So I'll stop for now here, and we can continue later.
Thank you very much, Ladislava. Thank you also for highlighting a few interesting points. One, which I think was a bit forgotten, is that you put the Czech presidency also in a regional context in Central Europe, which I think is important. Thank you also for focusing very much on energy in a very differentiated way. On the one hand, linked, of course, to the war in Ukraine, but also pointing beyond that in a larger framework. And thank you also, since I'm sitting in Austria, in pointing out that there are different views on nuclear energy, which is also, I think, a very healthy educative process if you are sitting in Vienna. Before giving the floor to Paul, let me just point out to the audience that we might have the possibility to deal with 2 or 3 questions at the end if we still have time. And Paul, I know you have many things to say. I just wondered if you could also pick up maybe some issues which I haven't really heard mentioning, at least not in a specific way. The Czech presidency also focused, of course, on issues related to enlargement on the Western Balkans. There was the summit in Tirana. So I think this is an important part of the agenda, which sometimes is a bit forgotten, also with the visa liberalization agreement on Kosovo finally. And there's also one issue which, of course, is not really a presidency priority, but at the end of the presidency, the Czech Republic in the chair also had to deal with Hungary. And I think that was also requiring quite a bit of skillful negotiations. So, Paul, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Dietmar. There are so many issues in the air that I don't really know. I don't really know where to start, but let me maybe point out one or two things which I have heard, which I would like to react to. I think I very much agree to what the three speakers before me have said, of course, with the exception of nuclear energy. That's the caveat that's important from an Austrian perspective. And it is also, by the way, related to energy dependency and energy independence, depending on how you see it. 2 points I would like to make. One is Martin and Georgina raised the issue of awareness and impact that a council presidency has on public opinion. I think raising awareness is already something. I mean, I know we would all wish for the public to have a broader knowledge on the issues that were dealt with and on all the details of the legislative acts that were passed, but that's probably too much to ask. That's wishful thinking. But if there's a gut feeling, if there's a positive emotion, if there's awareness, I think then we have already achieved something. I mean, of course, we all want to achieve more, but that's something we can actually build on. And there's another thing that the presidencies have in common, which was not mentioned, which is the electoral cycles somehow. We've had the presidential elections in France, which somehow cut short and dominated also the council presidency. We've just had presidential elections after the council presidency in the Czech Republic with, I think, from an integrational point of view, quite a positive outcome, which I think a lot of cooperation can be built on. And in October, there were parliamentary elections in Sweden with an outcome that also impacts the new Swedish government and its task when it comes to managing the council presidency. Another point I would like to make is that, in fact, the Czech presidency has shown one more time how important it is to have those council rotating presidencies. I think it is a sign of diversity. It gives new perspectives, new impacts, even if the presidencies are very much dominated by crisis management. But still, I think these very particular national, focusing nationally on certain issues, I think is where which makes the agenda of the European Union more interesting and diverse. I think that's an important issue. Many things have been said on the track record of the Czech Council presidency. Just two or three things that I would like to add to this list, which are really important from our point of view, is of course managing to preserve the cohesion and the unity of the European Union in such difficult times. Very, very important, it was said before, are the price caps and the mechanisms on the energy prices, gas and oil. Sometimes, if you look at the mechanism that was actually defined in terms of gas, it is not so much the mechanism that really counts, but the consensus that was reached and the political signaling to the markets, I think, because if you remember, there's some analysts who would say, well, we would rather wish for this mechanism to never be tested because it's just so complicated. Now, another thing that was really important was the approval of the financial support for Ukraine. Dietmar has asked for it. I mean, that's where a lot of negotiating skill went into to find a mechanism to do away with the Hungarian blockade. I think that was really good, but also when it comes to the EU minimum corporate tax, where we had a Polish issue there, where the Czech presidency managed to find a way around it. But Dietmar, you asked about enlargement. I think, well, that was the semester when the negotiations were started with Albania and North Macedonia. So that's quite a good momentum. Candidate status was given to Bosnia-Herzegovina. Kosovo applied for EU membership. Croatia just entered the Schengen area and introduced the euro. So that's a positive momentum for enlargement. That's also something that was driven by the Czech Republic. I mean, the progress that needs to be made to actually start negotiations with Ukraine and Moldavia is on the top of the agenda. We just had more than half of the European Commission visiting Kiev for the EU-Ukraine summit. But there's a lot of diversity of views on this, of course, in the EU capitals, and that's why there was a rather abstract. There was no concrete timing on when this would actually start. There's still these 7 criteria which Ukraine has to comply with, and then there's an opinion and a report by the European Commission, and of course the member states have to decide with unanimity. That's something that is on track, and there's action there. So there's something actually going on. Two issues on the downside, from my point of view, are one of the victims of all this crisis management and urgency was, of course, the whole debate on the future of Europe. But that's also a victim which had already fallen during the French EU presidency, if I may put it that way. And the second one was, of course, the postponement of the Schengen enlargement when it comes to Bulgaria and Romania. But there, Austria also had not just a very minor role in this, I would say. And then my last point would be on the European political community, which was already mentioned by Georgina. I think I agree with you, that was something very important for the French, and it's historically good that this first meeting actually took place during the Czech Council Presidency in Prague, back to back with the informal meeting of the EU heads of states of government. But I think it's still too early to actually judge whether this is going to be a successful new community, a forum, whatever you want to call it. I mean, will it be a new parallel club searching for a raison d'etre? Is that where we are? We already have the Council of Europe, which is quite similar. But in fact, the main goal it did achieve, which was to get 44 heads of state and government from Europe and from the European neighborhood together in Prague, and to give a political sign and signal of unity vis-a-vis Russia. I think that was the main issue. And then there were so many topics which were supposed to be on the agenda. It might have been just a little overloaded. It is, of course, intergovernmental. Some optimists would argue we don't need any structure here because this is just for political dialogue on the highest level. That's all we need. But is this really the case? Is there actually, what role is there for the European institutions? Is it actually feasible to implement projects and cooperation if you don't have the structure? Is it just a red carpet talking club where heads of states and government meet, or can it actually work without zero bureaucracy, or is this just wishful thinking? I mean, we will have the next meeting in Moldavia, then Spain, then the UK. It's good to see them all around the table. Let's see if an efficient secretariat, small and efficient, would actually do the trick. Once they have met 2-3 times, we will see if they are up to the challenge, if the top level will be still meeting, or if it will be just ministers or high-level experts and people from the hierarchy. Is there enough commitment? I mean, if you remember, look into the past a little bit, there was something similar initiated by President Sarkozy, which was the Mediterranean Union, and it's been a long time that we have heard something from it. So it's still too early to actually, still too early for a final judgment. But I think I think what we've seen in Prague was actually a very, very good start. Let's see if it lasts. One more thing I would like to say, I would like to congratulate also Europeum, because they managed also to get the think tanks to Prague. We all were there, and I think that was something that was best practice. I mean, that was something that others should do as well, because these interlinkages and communications and sharing of analysis and openly discussing the issues is a real added value. I mean, that's something that we can learn from. And one last point on the climate section of Fit for 55. It was mentioned a little bit, but there's something where more progress actually was expected. But what we achieved actually was the end of the CO2 emitted cars by 2035. So that's already something, but critics would say that's a really good performance, but there's still so many exceptions to this legislative act. But overall, I think the Czech Republic has done a very good job, and others could learn from that. And I also think that this is something that the Czech Republic as a country, its image, its role, but also the public will actually benefit from.
Thank you, Paul. I think you mentioned many issues. Thank you also for mentioning the almost forgotten conference on the future of Europe. And I think you raised a number of issues with regard to the European political community. This will require, I think, much more detailed discussion, which we intend to lead also in a number of other events. But I think it's important to point out the opportunities, but also the potential limitations and drawbacks. And thank you also for, in addition to focusing on specific issues, to also mention the overall achievement, I think, which cannot be stressed often enough, mainly how the Czech presidency managed to preserve cohesion and unity in difficult circumstances. Last but not least, certainly Olivia. Olivia, feel free to comment on anything the previous speaker said, but there might be one issue which was always sort of there in the background, but never specifically addressed, which of course is defense. And I think it would also be interesting in this format, focusing very much on the three Central European countries in the Austerlitz format, to discuss a bit on how the war in Ukraine and the presidencies in France and the Czech Republic changed a bit and influenced attitudes about defense thinking and policies in our countries. So please.
Thank you. So I will mention some general points on defense, and then I will move to the Visegrad countries and Austria. So in the light of the current war in Ukraine, it is clear that Europe has to stay united and shift to strengthen its defense. NATO is the central framework for Europe's military response to Russia's war. Therefore, one of the priorities of the Czech presidency was to strengthen the NATO-EU cooperation. An important milestone was the signing of the third joint EU-NATO declaration to expand the strategic partnership between NATO and the EU. But in these difficult times, Europe has to become also a credible military power, and NATO is not enough. Europe will never become a geopolitical actor without forging a stronger European defense base, which could complement NATO's defense efforts. The European, let's say, marginal role in European security until now could be explained by the absence of a common European threat perception and lack of financial resources. But since the war, there is a common will regarding the European countries to spend more and better on European defense and seek for European strategic autonomy. Both the EU and NATO are key actors in responding to the war. The increased defense spending with countries having proclaimed to spend more in line with the 2% target is very important. Poland, for example, wants to spend 3% of its GDP on defense spending this year, and Germany announced to spend 100 billion euros and meet the 2% target too. Austria, for example, also will increase its defense spending from 0.7 to 8.5%, and also plans to modernize its army and invest 3.3 billion. As also Slovakia is trying to increase its budget and meet the 2% target. Just to mention another focus point of the presidency, of the Czech presidency, Russia's war on Ukraine has further demonstrated that being able to move troops and military equipment across Europe and beyond is essential for security. Therefore, the PESCO project military mobility was also a successful platform and example in this regard, as well as the adoption of the EU MAM Ukraine with the initial duration of 2 years, which provides specialized training to Ukraine armed forces. Just to mention, the EU came up with a lot of promising initiatives, however, with not that much results. But this time it could be different. So with the strategic compass, which is a great building block in place, the Czech presidency was focusing on its successful implementation. It is the first time that an agreed EU threat assessment is mentioned there. The strategic compass could lead to a robust EU in defense if implemented correctly, allowing the member states to stand by the mutual obligation of assistance deriving from the Article 42. I also want to mention that now is the important impetus for Europe to finally make a long-needed change and not to lose this impetus. The Zeitenwende speech in Germany righteously stated that the world will never be the same again, and a more leadership in Europe in this regard is needed. As we could see when it comes to response to Ukraine, on the front line have been the northern and eastern European countries. Poland, for instance, is the center of gravity of the V4 and important at NATO's eastern flank. It is one of the biggest supporters of Ukraine. Its plans to increase to have 250,000 soldiers from its current 120,000, which is a huge step. It has also provided great humanitarian assistance, response. It welcomed 4 million refugees and also is a leading contributor when it comes to military aid. And also it was very effective in calling for tougher sanctions against Russia. Just to mention, Slovakia also recently announced the approval of a new package of military aid to Ukraine. What is important is that it also delivered the S-300 long-range surface to air missile system. And as well as Czech Republic plans to deliver Leopard tanks to Ukraine. The only country from the Visegrad countries lagging behind is Hungary. The country's reaction differs significantly from that of the other Visegrad countries, as Orban's government refused to deliver direct military support to Ukraine and complicated the sanctions process as well. And Hungary is also the reason why the Visegrad group remains currently fragmented. Orban's, now I will just shortly, I don't know if I'm still allowed to in the 7 minutes, but I would shortly mention also energy, because Orban's response to his actions was that Hungary is very much energy dependent on Russia, and the country needs Russia in this regard. But all V4 countries, Central Europe, Austria as well, are dependent on Russia when it comes to Russian gas and oil, up to 80%. Austria, for example, managed to decrease this dependency, and it is down to 50%. Here also comes to play another important initiative that the Czech presidency focused on, the EU Repower Europe, under which Europe seeks to end its dependency on fossil fuels imported from Russia, and also accelerate more renewables or alternatives. When it comes to alternatives, a very important source is the LNGs. However, there was a problem with infrastructure when it comes to LNGs, which is very unevenly distributed and has almost no LNG terminals when it comes to Central or Eastern Europe. Poland has tried for years to diversify away and step up its imports of LNG from the US. There is a new pipeline bringing Norwegian gas to Poland. Poland plans to increase its LNG terminal capacity and enhance interconnections with Slovak Republic and Czech Republic. The WEFR countries, as I said, are also increasing the acceleration of renewables. Just to mention the example of Slovakia, Slovakia has a great potential for wind farms. 20% of Slovak land is suitable for wind farms, but currently it's lagging behind. When it comes, for example, to Austria, Austria is focusing also on alternatives, LNG coming from mostly Croatia, the terminal in Krk, but is also focusing on renewables, hydropower and wind power. So as we can see, Central Europe is steadily moving away and decreasing its dependency. And I don't know if we have time, so I will stop here. Thank you for the word.
Thank you very much, Livia, and thank you for focusing very specifically on the defense and also some of the core energy issues facing the Central European countries. I think that's a welcome addition to the discussion. We have about 10 minutes left, so what I would like to do is to ask all of you for a very short final round. I think one of the things which came up in the discussion was, first of all, I think uniform praise for the Czech presidency, and of course also for the preceding French package to steer the European Union through this year in extraordinary year, I think in a very professional, capable way, preserving, as was mentioned repeatedly, the unity of the Union. The other thing which came up, Georgina mentioned that when I asked her also to say a brief word on where she thinks we stand after this year, was that there are things which I think nobody would have thought possible a year ago, certainly in the area of the European Union financing the delivery of arms through the peace facility. But I think also where we stand on industrial policy, I think this is also not something which would have been advanced in the same way without the last year. Livia, you mentioned very specifically the efforts needed in the area of defense and energy. So there are a number of things which I think would lead us to the conclusion that the European Union has basically done well. Of course, there is another view saying that what the last year showed was, despite all the good intentions, despite the strategic compass, despite all the efforts, basically what the aggression of Russia and Ukraine did was to sound the death knell to the concept, at least in the defense area, of the European strategic autonomy, as we are seeing sort of the return of NATO in a way which few people would have thought would happen a while ago, with the applications of Sweden and Finland, and also I think the extraordinary role the United States is playing in all that, which I think had a huge impact on the alliance, and where some observers would say clearly this puts the European Union in a secondary role and not in an equal role. So I think there are a lot of things which could be judged in different ways depending on a viewpoint, and the picture is always mixed. But I just wonder if I could ask each of you sort of for a short 2 minutes comment on where do you think this last year leaves the European Union, in spite of the impressive, as was mentioned also by Martin, short-term achievements, possibly at the expense of focusing on some of the longer-term issues. Martin, if I could invite you, and please feel free also to comment on what colleagues said.
Okay, thank you very much for like all the topics. Unfortunately, like we don't have more time to discuss it more in depth or like focus on like particular security issues as Lydia was speaking, or like more like on a green topics there. As I was speaking for rather long in my first interview, or I would rather like say that first and foremost, what I would hope for is that the Czech presidency and also like all the implications of the presidency, but all the challenges we are together facing with all member state countries will be somehow like even deeper strengthening the unity with us. They will be strengthening the solidarity among member states, but also solidarity with Ukraine. And now we see that we are like in extremely turbulent and challenging time, and things we'll be expecting 2-3 years ago are now like our daily bread, unfortunately. And there is so much things we need to like sort of prepare for, and being the war in Ukraine, being the potential enlargement of the EU, being all the other things there we could discuss for hours. It brings new challenges, and these challenges definitely needs to be tackled together, needs to be tackled by all EU membership countries in one format, rather than Austria finding their own attitude, Czech Republic finding their own, and so on. So we see that it's possible, and unfortunately we learned due to bad consequences, but it's possible, and now we must persist, and we must really like use the formats we established and broaden it even deeper, because it's needed. Otherwise we will totally defragment, and it will cost of us much more than efforts to do it together.
Thank you, Martin. Georgina.
Very quickly, I mean, I think if we understood strategic autonomy as independence of the United States, I think the Ukraine war has proven that that is dead. But if we understand it differently, which is actually the EU's ability to make its own decisions that apply to it, then I think we're in very much a lively debate around EU strategic autonomy, or sovereignty is the word that we seem to prefer nowadays. And I think we've seen in defense that transatlantic unity and working with the United States is essential. I think that brings all sorts of questions about, what happens, for example, in the case of invasion of Taiwan. Can the EU continue to sort of have this middle ground between the United States and China? Will it have to align at some point? But I also think that this transatlantic unity shouldn't cloud our judgment on everything else that is happening right now, and the fact that the United States and China are adopting policies where they're placing national preference at the heart of their industrial policy. And that will have some impact on EU industry. Not, I'm not a scaremonger, which is this is the end of EU green tech industry. I don't think that's the case, but I do think it will have an impact, and that Europe as a whole, or the EU, needs to be thinking about all sorts of things in terms of energy dependence. We're lessening our dependence on Russian fossil fuels. Do we want to become dependent on LNG from certain countries, on hydrogen coming from other countries? But it also poses significant questions about how we support our own industry, which will be so essential, as we've seen. Vladi was making the point about, the automobile industry and climate transition. And I think that the EU's going to have to become much more geopolitical in its thinking. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Vladislava.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, what we were talking, it made me think that we have been breaking some taboos. So precedents have been set. So this gives us a hope that in the future we'll be able to break more taboos and move forward. The exhibited unity and solidarity they have seen this year, I guess, me that tend to be optimistic, I want to give a bit of a tale of caution that how long this can be sustained. So to focus on sustaining this unity and solidarity, because in short term, of course, we were in front of a great adversary, but our societies are starting to waver a bit, looking through different survey results on this resolute support for Ukraine, or policies, not only towards Ukraine, but European policies as well. And so I think that we need to also take in account the domestic needs and challenges and put them through a European perspective. And also we should probably pay attention to the malign foreign influence. And in our region, we are very susceptible on other type of policies that Russia or China are also using. So we need to be a little bit careful when it comes to disinformation and propaganda, and put the focus there as well. But there was a question, actually, I noticed from the audience on the external action of EU's external action, and what can we do? Yes, it's an interesting idea to counter Chinese Belt and Road initiative with the gateway, global gateway presented recently. I am not sure that I'm able to judge it that this is a good countering as of yet, because also it's new, and China has been working for a long time on their type of influence and networking and drawing in towards their center of gravity a lot of unaligned or non-aligned countries and partners. But what I can see is that, again, going back to stop being so Eurocentric, but also start looking maybe into partnerships that are in the Indo-Pacific region, because what Georgina exactly said, that because it is shifting, the focus is shifting in that region. And so for us probably will be quite wise, and the Czech presidency have done through the FTAs, for example, work with New Zealand and Australia. That's a good example, but we really need to step it up with India, with Australia, with New Zealand, with South Korea, with Japan, just to name a few, where we need to probably broker much closer ties and better partnerships in order for us ourselves to be globally relevant. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul, as a professional optimist, what is your take?
Yes. Let me think about this. I would say I mean, there are huge consequences of the Russian aggression against Ukraine for Europe, for the European Union. I think the European Union has managed to rise to the different challenges in this first year. But what is really important is, I think, to actually be able to sustainably balance the internal and external challenges which we face. We have the European elections coming up. We see the impact on public opinion and on national elections of the difficult economic development which we live in. We have to somehow find the equilibrium, the balance between what we are actually able to achieve in geopolitical global terms versus what we have to do internally to maintain this unity and cohesion, which is, I think, so important and so crucial in order to be able to improve and further enhance this international role. I think a strategic diversity is very important. Geopolitical diversity, not only autonomy, but diversity is key. Last week we just had the presentation of the new industrial plan of the European Union, presented by the European Commission. But I think that's still up to discussion as well. I mean, the French and German ministers of the economy were in Washington, or still in Washington, together, talking about a European economy. But I mean, the French-German tandem is crucial and key. But of course, they're not the only one. What we actually need is sustainable commitment to do this together, and a political will to do this together. And then we can actually live up to the geopolitical needs, which also imply rethinking enlargement, rethinking neighborhood policies. The global gateway has good intentions, but is it really focused enough? Do we have enough? Have we given it enough strategic thinking? The transnational agenda, the transnational relations are becoming more and more important and are key to all these developments. But where is this independent European rule role. We've talked about it when it comes to Asia, for example. Now, I think we've done very well. We've done probably better than many would have expected in this consensus-driven European Union. And I think what we have to do now is just work hard on maintaining this consensus and on making sure that we have one position towards Russia, and maintaining this position and try to alleviate, I think, the economic and financial costs that this all has on the European Union.
Thank you very much. A final short word from you, Livia.
Yes, so I think that it has shown now, the process has shown that the member states are more united, and they realize that it's, as it was already mentioned, important to be less dependent when it comes to defense, but also energy. I think the European Union doesn't need more new strategies, but implementation, and it has to keep the impetus alive. Also, as I already mentioned, it's important to have a leadership from the Franco-German duo. And Russia's war was a wake-up call, and it can be seen also from the example of Sweden and Finland wanting to join NATO, but also a country like Austria, even though it's neutral, contributed, for example, to the European Peace Facility, which was a big step for Austria. It was heavily criticized within the country. And I also think initiatives like the Three Seas Initiative could become more important in the region, Central European region, because this initiative supports the LNG infrastructure buildup. And just a final word, as I said, after the war is over, many countries might reconsider its position towards Russia, and might keep a long-term downturn of relations. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank all of you for what I think has been a very rich discussion. We knew in advance that it would be impossible in 75 minutes to do justice to all the challenges which the European Union faces, and also justice to the achievements during the French and especially now the Czech presidency. But I think we covered a lot of ground, and I thought that we also had a good measure of agreement where we stand, which I think is not an entirely optimistic one, but overall, I think the judgment, if I may draw that conclusion, is that the European Union did a better than expected job in facing the challenges which arose after the 24th of February, and especially due to the fact that it was possible to keep the European Union together in a way which few people would have thought possible, at least makes the outlook rather more positive than negative, if I might say. So once again, thank you very much to all of you. It's been a good cooperation before, and I'm looking forward to doing this again in a different way. Many thanks, and have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.